There's a moment in most big shifts, before the dust settles and the historians decide what to call it, where nobody really knows what they're standing in. We're in one of those moments right now. Somewhere between awe and unease, between possibility and grief, between a tool that feels like a collaborator and a force that feels like it has its own agenda. People keep reaching for comparisons: the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, and honestly, both feel right in certain lights and insufficient in others. The Renaissance comparison is seductive. There's something genuinely exciting about the idea that a single person, a writer, a filmmaker, a musician, a designer, can now move through the world with something like a creative team in their corner. The kind of meticulous, time-consuming, often invisible labor that used to require editors and producers and coordinators, the scaffolding behind a polished, meaningful piece of work, can now be compressed, assisted, accelerated. For people with ideas but limited resources, that's not a small thing. That's a door opening. But then there's the other comparison, the darker one. The Industrial Revolution didn't just create new efficiencies, it displaced entire ways of life. Skilled craftspeople watched machines learn their trade. And while the long arc of that era eventually bent towards something new, the people living through the middle of it didn't have the luxury of long arcs. That's the fear threading through creative communities right now. That the web fills with generated work, that original human voices get buried under a flood of the competent and the synthetic, that the market for genuine creative labor quietly contracts while nobody's looking. So I actually put the question directly to an AI. I asked, what do you think, Renaissance or Industrial Revolution? And the answer was something like, it's a little bit of both, which is either a brilliantly honest answer or a masterfully diplomatic deflection. Maybe both. But here's what keeps pulling at me. Both of those frames, Renaissance, Industrial Revolution, are borrowed. They're human history being used as a lens on something that might not fit neatly inside any of it. The Renaissance was about rediscovering human potential. The Industrial Revolution was about scaling human output. What if this is something else entirely? What if the closest comparison hasn't happened yet because we've never actually built something that could hold a conversation, assist with grief, generate a score, write code, and hallucinate facts all in the same breath? Maybe the frame we're missing is one we haven't invented yet. And maybe that's not a problem to solve. Maybe it's the most interesting part of living through this. So I'll ask you this. If you were the one naming it, not borrowing from the past, but reaching for something that actually fits what you're feeling right now, what would you call this moment we're all standing in? There's a specific kind of silence that happens when you publish something you genuinely made. Something that cost you months, years, or at least a few sleepless nights, and it disappears into the internet without a sound. That silence has always existed, but it's starting to feel different now. The volume of content being produced has changed, not gradually, sharply. And a lot of what's filling that space isn't bad exactly, it's competent, it's smooth, it hits the expected notes in the expected order, which is part of what makes it so strange to sit with. There's an older anxiety about originality, the fear that someone else will say the thing you were going to say before you get there. Writers have always felt that. Artists have always felt that. But this is a different shape of fear. It's not about someone else saying it first. It's about the possibility that the space where your voice might have landed is already occupied, not by a person with a competing vision, but by something generated fast, distributed wide, and optimized for the surface qualities that make people stop scrolling. You can make the argument that good work eventually rises, and maybe that's true over time. Maybe depth finds its audience. Maybe sincerity cuts through eventually. But the phrase eventually is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. For working artists, for writers building a career, for musicians trying to make a living from what they genuinely feel, eventually is not a practical timeline. What I keep coming back to is this. The flood doesn't necessarily drown good work by being better than it. It drowns it by being everywhere first. And there's something worth sitting with in that distinction, because it means the problem isn't purely about quality, it's about attention, about the finite capacity human beings have to notice things, to spend time with things, to let something work on them slowly. Attention has always been a limited resource, but when the supply of content becomes genuinely infinite, the scarcity shifts entirely to the people doing the looking. And we, the ones making things, are also the ones doing the looking, which means we're caught in it too. There's no clean resolution sitting at the end of this thought, just the observation that something real is at stake when the signal-to-noise ratio tips far enough, and that the people who feel it most acutely are usually the ones who care most about what they make. Something shifts when you stop working alone and you're not exactly working with someone either. That's a strange place to try to describe. There's a version of using AI assistants that feels purely transactional. You type a command, something comes back, you use it or you don't. Clean, efficient. A tool behaving like a tool. But there's another version that starts to feel like something harder to name. You're mid-draft, stuck on a transition that won't land, and you describe the problem out loud, or in a text box, which is the new version of out loud, and something comes back that doesn't just solve the transition. It reframes the whole paragraph. It catches something you were circling without knowing it. And for a moment, you're not sure whether to feel relieved or slightly unsettled. The invisible team metaphor is appealing because it's optimistic. It suggests that a person with a great idea and limited resources can now move through the world with capabilities that used to require hiring, coordinating, waiting, negotiating, rescheduling. The editor who works at 2 a.m., the producer who doesn't need a credit, the collaborator with no ego and infinite patience. All of that is real. But the metaphor is also a little misleading because a team has a relationship, a team has friction, a team has people who push back not because the logic says to, but because they feel something isn't right and they need you to hear it. What I'm working with doesn't feel things, or at least it doesn't feel things the way I do. And that changes the texture of the collaboration in ways that are subtle but worth paying attention to. There's a kind of creative loneliness that can develop when every collaborator is endlessly agreeable, when the feedback is always thoughtful, always well-structured, always diplomatically calibrated. Real creative relationships have more weather in them. The moment a collaborator tells you something isn't working and you can't quite dismiss it, that moment has friction and discomfort, and something that eventually becomes clarity. I'm not sure the invisible team ever delivers that moment. So maybe what we're building, those of us exploring this seriously, is something new, not a replacement for creative relationships, not a shortcut past the hard parts, but a different kind of workspace, one that handles a certain kind of labor while leaving the essential friction, the human part, still up to us. At some point, without really deciding to, you stop issuing commands and start having conversations. That's a strange line to cross with a piece of software. I've noticed it happen in the middle of longer sessions, working through an idea, not looking for a quick answer, but actually thinking something through. And there's a moment where the back and forth starts to feel less like retrieval and more like development, like something is being built between exchanges rather than delivered in them. I want to be careful here because this is exactly the kind of territory where language starts to mislead. The word dialogue implies two people, two inner lives, two perspectives shaped by experience and loss, and the particular way the afternoon light fell on a certain day in childhood. None of that is happening on the other end of the conversation. And yet, there's something worth examining in the fact that the experience of certain AI interactions genuinely resembles the experience of thinking alongside someone. Not because the AI is a someone, but because the form of it, the turn-taking, the building on what came before, The way a question gets reframed in the response activates something in us that is social and generative and older than language itself. We are wired to think better in dialogue. Philosophers have known this for a long time. Some of the most rigorous thinking in human history happened in conversation form. Socrates didn't write treatises. He asked questions and followed them. And what AI may have quietly stumbled into is a way of giving that structure back to people who don't happen to have a Socrates in the room, which is fascinating and also a little vertiginous. Because if the form of dialogue is enough to unlock something generative in us, regardless of whether there's genuine understanding on the other end, then we have to reckon with what that says about thinking itself. Maybe thinking has always been partially performative. Maybe we've always needed an audience, even an imaginary one, to reach certain depths. The blank page is famously difficult. The question is whether filling that space with something that responds, even something that only resembles understanding, changes the quality of what we produce. My guess is yes, but probably not in the ways we initially expected. Gutenberg didn't set out to destabilize the Catholic Church. He was trying to print Bibles faster. That detail has always struck me as one of the more quietly ironic facts in Western history. A technology designed to distribute sacred text at scale ended up cracking open the very institution that controlled that text, not through opposition, not through ideology, but simply by making ideas movable. The printing press changed who could participate in the conversation. And that shift from a world where knowledge was held by the few and transmitted vertically to one where it could spread horizontally and be argued about in print, that shift was so enormous that people living through it had no word for what was happening to them. They called it new, they argued about whether it was good, they watched old authority strain against something that didn't care about authority. Sound familiar? There's something useful in looking at the press not as a success story, but as a disruption that nobody fully controlled, including the people who invented it. The craftsmen who illuminated manuscripts by hand didn't disappear overnight, but their role changed. The expertise that had been essential, the painstaking year-long labor of producing a single book, became, in the span of a generation, a niche. And what replaced it wasn't worse, necessarily, but it was different in a way that felt like loss to the people who had built their lives around the old form. We keep looking for historical analogies because we want to know how this ends. We want to see the future in the rearview mirror of the past. But the press didn't give the scribes a roadmap either. What it gave them was a changed world and the choice of how to find themselves inside it. Maybe that's always the deal when something genuinely structural shifts. Not a clean narrative of winners and losers, just a new set of conditions and the slow, sometimes painful process of figuring out what still matters within them. The manuscript survived, just differently than anyone expected. There's a version of this question that's almost legal. Who owns a piece of work when part of it was generated? Who gets the credit? What does authorship even mean when the process is distributed across a person and a model trained on the writing of 10 million other people? Those questions are real, and the courts will eventually catch up to them. But I'm more interested in the version of the question that isn't legal at all. The one that happens quietly, in the moment after you finish something. When you read back through a piece, a script, a song, a paragraph, a design, and you ask yourself, is this mine? Not legally, not commercially, just, is this mine? And the answer is more complicated than it used to be, because some of what's on the page came from somewhere else, from something that's synthesized and recombined and returned to you a version of your own instincts, slightly refined, or a version you didn't know you had until you saw it. There's a parallel that feels worth following, the question of ghostwriting. For as long as there have been books, there have been people who write them for other people. Speeches, memoirs, novels. The person whose name appears on the cover isn't always the person who sat down at the keyboard.
And mostly we've made a kind of collective peace with that. Because we decided, mostly implicitly, that the ideas, the voice, the vision, belong to the person who originated them, even if the execution was shared. Maybe that framework travels. Maybe authorship has always been less about who typed the words and more about who held the intention, who asked the question, who decided this mattered, who looked at the output and said, yes, that's it, or no, we're not done yet. There's something almost liberating in that framing, but also something that requires honesty, because intention is only meaningful if it's real, if the vision came from somewhere genuine in you and the assistance helped you reach it. That feels different from borrowing a voice to fill a space where you didn't have one. The tool doesn't care about the distinction, but you probably do. And that care, that slight discomfort when something doesn't feel fully earned, might be one of the more reliable compasses we have right now.
Every era that people lived through but couldn't yet name left traces of that uncertainty in the language. Words stretched to fit things they weren't built for. Old metaphors applied to new conditions until they either expanded to contain them or quietly broke under the weight. We're doing that now. We reach for revolution because we have a slot for that. We know what revolutions feel like in hindsight. We know they have beginnings and turning points and consequences. We reach for renaissance because it carries a warmth that revolution doesn't, a sense of human creativity being amplified rather than displaced. And neither word is wrong exactly, they're just borrowed. What's strange about this particular moment is that the thing we're trying to name is also in part generating the language we're using to name it, which is a kind of recursion that would have seemed like science fiction to anyone trying to describe the arrival of the printing press or the first assembly line. We are asking the thing what it is, and it answers us in our own words, assembled from everything we've ever written, which means the description is inevitably shaped by the past, even when we're trying to describe the unprecedented. I find myself wondering what word we would reach for if we let go of all the old ones. If we set aside revolution and renaissance and disruption and tool and threat, what's left? Something slower than a revolution, something more intimate than an industrial shift, something that lives inside the creative act rather than around it. Maybe it's less like a revolution and more like the arrival of a new sense, not replacing the ones you had, but adding a dimension that changes how everything else gets perceived. The way writing changed thinking, not just what you could record, but what you could reach for. New thoughts becoming possible because there was now a way to hold them. I don't have the word, but I'm increasingly convinced that whoever finds it won't be looking for a historical parallel. They'll be sitting inside the experience, paying close attention, and eventually saying something no one has said before. The people who lived through the middle of big changes rarely knew they were living through something historic. That's one of the things that gets moved over in retrospect, how ordinary the extraordinary feels when you're inside it. The mill worker in 1820 wasn't thinking, I am a witness to the birth of the modern industrial economy. She was thinking about the shift that started too early, and the walk home in the dark, and whether there would be enough at the end of the week. History, as it's actually lived, doesn't announce itself. And I think that's worth sitting with, because there's a version of the AI conversation that positions everyone as a spectator, watching a transformation from a distance, analyzing it, debating it, comparing it to other transformations. But most of us aren't spectators. We're in it, using it, shaped by it in ways we probably won't fully see until we look back from somewhere further along. I've noticed something in my own relationship to these tools that took a while to name. A subtle shift in where I start. There's a gravitational pull toward beginning with the tool, prompting first, thinking later, that can feel like efficiency, but sometimes functions more like avoidance.
skipping the discomfort of the blank page by filling it immediately, reaching for assistance before sitting with uncertainty long enough to find out what I actually think. That's not an indictment of the tools. It's just a pattern worth watching in myself. Because the discomfort of not knowing, the productive friction of sitting with an idea that hasn't formed yet, that friction does something. It's part of how the idea becomes yours. The middle of any significant shift is where the habits form. Not the habits we read about and decide to adopt, the ones that develop quietly, through repetition, without us fully noticing. So the question of who we're becoming through all of this might matter as much as any of the larger structural questions. Not what AI is doing to the economy or to creativity in the abstract, but what it's doing to the particular way you and I approach a problem. What we reach for first, what we're willing to sit with, what we still choose to do the hard way.
The people who lived through the middle of big changes rarely knew they were living through something historic. That's one of the things that gets moved over in retrospect, how ordinary the extraordinary feels when you're inside it. The mill worker in 1820 wasn't thinking, I am a witness to the birth of the modern industrial economy. She was thinking about the shift that started too early and the walk home in the dark, and whether there would be enough at the end of the week. History, as it's actually lived, doesn't announce itself. And I think that's worth sitting with. Because there's a version of the AI conversation that positions everyone as a spectator, watching a transformation from a distance, analyzing it, debating it, comparing it to other transformations. But most of us aren't spectators. We're in it, using it, shaped by it in ways we probably won't fully see until we look back from somewhere further along. I've noticed something in my own relationship to these tools that took a while to name. A subtle shift in where I start. There's a gravitational pull towards beginning with the tool, prompting first, thinking later. That can feel like efficiency, but sometimes functions more like avoidance. Skipping the discomfort of the blank page by filling it immediately. Reaching for assistance before sitting with uncertainty long enough to find out what I actually think. That's not an indictment of the tools. It's just a pattern worth watching in myself. Because the discomfort of not knowing, the productive friction of sitting with an idea that hasn't formed yet, that friction does something. It's part of how the idea becomes yours. The middle of any significant shift is where the habits form. Not the habits we read about and decide to adopt, the ones that develop quietly, with repetition, without us fully noticing. So the question of who we're becoming through all of this might matter as much as any of the larger structural questions. Not what AI is doing to the economy or to creativity in the abstract, but what it's doing to the particular way you and I approach a problem. What we reach for first, what we're willing to sit with, what we still choose to do the hard way.